Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the Chess Champions Tour finals in the great year of 2024. Now the five-time World Chess Championship Magnus Carlsen is qualified for this event, and he's going to be taking on some of the best players in the world in rapid chess. Now the players who qualified alongside Magnus were Alireza Firouzja, Wesley So, Jan Nepomniachtchi, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, we had Denis Lazovic, and I believe there's one other player that I am forgetting, Vincent Keymer, who Magnus is playing in the first round. So with all these illustrious players having qualified from the online portion of this event, we now move to the over the board portion where the players are playing in person on a physical board, but they are wearing headphones to compete. Now with headphones in a live audience, it can be a little bit different. I myself am very familiar with this, having played in the final in 2023, but also having played in the Speed Chess Championship this year in Paris. So it's an exciting final happening in Norway. The setup is pretty straightforward. The players will be playing they'll be playing matches of 2 games each. The top 4 players, I believe it is, advance the final. It might be the top 6 and then something like that, but the top 4 will make it through. At any rate, they play these matches and let's see what happens. Now the format is straightforward. It's 10 plus 2 games. If it's tied, you go to Armageddon. All right, so first match of the day, Magnus is playing against Vincent Keymer, and he is starting with the white pieces. So the game starts out with the move knight f3. We get the move d5, and here Magnus plays the move e3. Now we get knight f6, and Magnus goes b3. Now this is an opening setup that yours truly, myself, the famous streamer Hikaru Nakamura, has used on many occasions. It also featured in the World Championship match between Ding and Gukesh. But Magnus actually, after this game, would go on the record and say that while he was in transit on the way to the playing site via the subway, he was inspired by the openings that I was playing in Title Tuesday. So today is obviously Tuesday, and with Magnus commuting to the event, he probably saw me playing in Title Tuesday, which began a little bit earlier. And honestly, it's just really nice to hear something like that, an illustrious world champion, arguably the greatest player of all time, is actually watching my stream. Now of course the Title Tuesday videos will probably end up on the channel as well down the road, but nonetheless it is great to hear. So we get b3. Now we have the move c5 played by Vinny. We get bishop b2, and here we have the move g6. Now I believe that another famous world champion, for all the wrong reasons, a player by the name of Vladimir Kramnik, actually played this, or he played knight c6 followed by g6 against me in a recent Title Tuesday as well. Nonetheless, these are positions that I've had a lot. So we get g6 here. Now Magnus plays the move bishop b5 check. We get bishop d7, and here he trades the bishop for the knight on f6. Now usually when I play against a setup, I usually take right away, play something like c3 followed by d4. But one thing you'll notice about this is that black has a compromised pawn structure here, but black does maintain the 2 b's. So when you play check, takes, queen d7 and c3 here, your aim is still to play for d4, but now black has a compromised pawn structure, but also he only has 1 bishop on the board. So without the pair of the b's, white should be completely fine. So we get knight c6. Now we have d4 being played, and here Vincent trades and goes bishop b4. Now it's worth pointing out that this is a very important nuance in the details, which is one thing you learn about chess is that when you grow up, you were taught that when you push a pawn to g6, for example, the whole idea is to go for the classic fianchetto with bishop to g7, and you have the bishop protecting the king. But in modern days, there are many different openings where you'll see the computer say play a g6 or a g3, and then it'll be like, you know what, just put the bishop on the other diagonal. Nobody cares at all. You don't have to follow the old school rules. So we get takes. Now we have takes, bishop b4, and here we get the move knight fd2 from Magnus. Now Magnus could have played knight bd2 here. He could also go for the classic meme by playing king e2, playing the classic bong cloud, and the computer actually does not hate this approach, but Magnus plays knight fd2 instead. Now we get rook c8, Magnus castles, we get castles, and here we have the move a3 being played. Vincent goes bishop d6, and now Magnus plays knight c3. Now at this point, you'll notice the computer still gives black a very small advantage, and primarily that is because even though the pawn structure is compromised, black can guard the pawn on d5 here. The pawn on a3 is a little bit weak, pawn on h2 is being spied upon, and black can try to line up a double or a triple stack on the c file. So Magnus goes knight e2. We get rook to c6 here, idea of rook c8 and queen c7 with the legendary triple stack and the double A battery hitting this pawn on h2 next to the white king. So we get b4 from Magnus. Now we have rook f c8, and here we get the move rook c1. Now this is a move that the computer actually doesn't love. It would prefer that white plays queen b3 here, but understandably, when you're playing a rapid game, you don't have a lot of time to think, and without spending say a minute or 2 minutes on this move, you very quickly can see rook c2 here hitting both of D's knights on d2 and e2. And if you play a move like rook a2, Now black can simply trade the rooks on a2, play queen f5 here, and suddenly there's a big threat of a kebab with rook c2 hitting the knights and the queen, and white is in all kinds of trouble. Now it's worth pointing out here, you're thinking, well, why not rook c1, contest the file? But if you go rook c1 here, black has a very nasty idea, which is you can sack the bishop temporarily, you take, and now I go queen to h5, checking the king and attacking the knight, a classic 90-degree right triangle. If you go king g3, there's knight f5, king f4, and I think check and knight h4 is simply checkmate here. And in this position, if you go for king to g1, black will trade the towers, go queen d1 check, and after king h2, queen c1. Now black is simply up a pawn. He has won this pawn on h2, and we're in an endgame where there's no risk, and frankly black should be completely winning. So we get rook c1 here. Vincent trades the rooks, and now he goes queen c7, and here we get the move g3, stopping the threats on the diagonal. Vincent plays queen c2, and now Magnus goes knight to b3. Now what's amazing about this, and this really highlights the difference between classical chess and rapid/blitz, is that at this point you'll notice the computer gives black an advantage here, but without a lot of time to think, it's very hard to come up with a concrete plan. And if you're playing this from the white side, even if you know you're objectively a little bit worse, you have a simple idea of putting a knight on b3 or e2, trying to contest the file, and all the pressure is on the player with the black pieces to try and create some play. So we get queen c2, knight b3. Now you'll notice already Magnus is not worse. We get queen d3, queen b1, queen a6, and now we get the move queen b2. Here Vincent plays b6, a logical move trying to stop the knight from jumping to the c5 square, but now we get rook c1. We get the trade of the rooks, and now we have h5 being played. Now I'm going to be honest, this is a game that looks frankly like a game that I could be playing in Title Tuesday very easily. It's a situation where you're a little bit worse, but once you survive the complications, you reach an endgame where you have D's knights against the bishop and the knights can rotate to pressure the pawn on d5, and even if the evaluation is objectively equal, it's much easier to play for white when you combine that with the classic Magnus effect. When I saw this position, I had zero doubt in my mind that Magnus would find a way to win. So now we get the move queen b3. Vinny plays queen c8. We get knight to e2 here, idea of knight c3 to pressure the pawn on d5, and now we get the move h4. Magnus plays knight c3, we get queen f5, and here we have the move queen b1 being played. Now it's very important here that you don't play a quiet move like queen d1, because after h3 there are some threats of a lolly checkmate. Say you play queen c1, I'm just going to make some random moves, knight b3 here. Now if black gets queen f3, suddenly there's this massive threat of the checkmate. White is still maybe only slightly worse after queen to f1, but the goal in this endgame is that you want to trade off the queens here with queen b1, because this bishop, even though it looks really nicely placed, is simply not really threatening anything. So we get queen g4. Magnus goes king g2, and now we get the move pawn takes pawn, and in my opinion this is a clear sign of the Magnus effect. Now if I were playing with black here, I'd probably ignore it, something like king g7, maybe even be looking at knight f5 here, but I would never trade on g3, because once you trade on g3, now any ideas of trying to checkmate the white king are gone. These pawns are actually very solid here. There's even knight f1 to guard everything here, so with the pressure on the pawn on d5 and the lack of weaknesses here, it's already game on, and definitely I'm expecting a Magnus Supreme. So we get king g7. Now we have queen d1, and here Vincent decides to trade the queens with no ideas of attacking on the king side. Here it makes sense to shift to the defensive task of trying to simply make the draw. However, in this endgame, you have the double pawns, you have the weak pawn on d5, and generally in blitz specifically, knights are almost always better than bishops. So with the options to start rerouting the knights, maneuvering them all over the board, it's definitely going to provide great opportunities for Magnus to win. So we get f5. Knight c3 is played, and now we get the move king f6. Magnus plays knight f3. We get g5, king f1, and now we get the move g4. Now this is something I was not a fan of when I saw it, because even though you're closing down the king side here, now the knights have all these great squares to maneuver to, f4 and e5. You can run the king to b3, and there simply is no counterplay on the king side. If I were playing with black here, would I be considering something like king to e6 here? Let's just say white goes knight e1, f6 here, and now you can maneuver the king back around to e6, but you'll notice here that you have not yielded the square. The pawn still covers it, but also say you go knight b2, there's always the option to play f4, creating pawn breaks on the king side. So g4 is completely fine objectively, but it means now that the knight is going to start wandering all over the place. E5 and f4. Now Magnus is going to start to dilly-dally, try to slowly play this, improve the position, and with only a minute on the clock, you already feel like Magnus will find a way to win. So Vincent goes knight g8 with king e2, knight f6 here, trying to put this knight on this e4 square, and now the game continues with king d2. We get knight e4, king c2, and now we have the move knight f6. Now here Vincent is just basically saying, you know what, I'm going to sit and wait, I'm going to follow the classic example, the former world champion. I'm just going to try to be chilling by moving the knight back and forth. So we get a4, knight e4, king b3, and now knight d2, king b2, and knight e4 back. Magnus goes king c2, we get a6 here, and this is a move that I'm a little bit surprised by actually, because considering that Vincent had simply been waiting with the knight on f6 e4, this already is a little bit of a sign of nervousness to play a6 here, because he's going away from what he had just done with the classic yo-yo of the knight back and forth. So here Magnus plays knight e2, we get king d7, and now we get the move knight c1. Again, with these knights, the knights can start maneuvering every which way. We get king c6, and now we have the move knight b3. Here Vincent plays king c7, we get knight c1, king c6, and now we get the move knight a2. Obviously, at this point in the game, Magnus is not worried at all. He's just going to continue to maneuver in the knights, try to keep Vincent very low on time, and hopefully Vincent will make a blunder. So we get king d7, knight c3, king e6, and now Magnus plays this move a5. Now this is perfect understanding of the position as well as time management from Magnus, because this is a very tough situation. Your opponent is down to 10 seconds. They think they've survived. They're maneuvering the knight back and forth, nothing happening on the king side of the board. But then when they have 10 seconds, you play this very committal move a5, and your opponent has to make a split-second decision on whether to take the pawn or play the move b5. Now, the computer wants black to trade the pawns here, but an illustration of how difficult this position to play is that the best move according to the computer is to go king d7, simply sacrificing the pawn on d5 and trying to bring the king to the queen side. With 10 seconds on the clock, there is no chance that you will ever do this, frankly, because you're not going to blunder the pawn. You have to change the whole concept, the way you're thinking about the position, and with no time on the clock, it's simply not intuitive, and you're never going to find it. So takes would have been a draw, but instead we get the move b5. Now Vincent probably thought here is that because now we have a classic clogged toilet situation, all the pawns are sort of locked up here, it should be a draw. However, there is one big issue, which is that even though the position is closed, there is this jumbo square for the horse. You can create the classic connect four here with the 3 pawns and the knight. You can also hit the pawn on a6. So with the connect four and the bastion here, knight c5 is the one trick in the position. So here we got the move knight to d1. Vincent goes king d7, and now we get the move knight c5. Now this is an interesting choice from Magnus here because it is very committal. I was thinking that Magnus here, perhaps he could have maneuvered his pieces, like get the king over to e2, guard these kingside pawns, and then look to play knight d1 and knight c5, but ultimately he decides to play knight c5 right away. Vincent plays bishop takes, we get pawn takes, and now we have the move king c7. Now shockingly, this is the move that loses the game on the spot for Vincent Keymer here. Now it's not obvious to understand why. The computer actually wants king e7, and the main reason it wants this is that if white ever goes knight c3 here in this sort of situation, after after here, let's say king d3, king e6, just to illustrate the point. White cannot play the move knight to c3 here simply because the pawn on e6 or a pawn on d5 is guarded, and at this point you go knight f2 and you are not worse. But we get king c7 instead, and as we're about to see, this move actually is simply losing, mainly because, as we're about to see, the white king runs to the center, and even though you're going to win the pawn on f2, the king on e6 is simply better than on c6. So here we get the move king d3. Vincent plays king c6, we get king d4, now we get f6, and here Magnus plays the move knight c3, offering the trade of the knights here, but the pawn on d5 is under attack. Now if you get this position, I believe without f6 being played, it might still be a draw. I guess actually it isn't a draw, because you can probably actually wait, no, I guess actually it's never a draw, frankly, even with the pawn on f7, because the king runs in, but I thought maybe there was a way to save the game. But at this point, it's already very bad. We get f6, knight c3, and now Vincent trades the knights inexplicably, and this is a losing blunder. Now, if black were to play knight g5 here, it's still very much a game. White is much better here after knight to e2, but the show does go on. You cannot play knight takes pawn on d5 here, because after knight to e6, checking the king, it's spaghetti-o time. Both of the squares on the e file are covered. You move the king to c3, you lose the horse on d5, and you lose the game. But Vincent's very low on time. He's obviously very frazzled. 6 seconds here. I mean, knight g5, knight e2 is still very difficult here, frankly, because I think you're supposed to go knight h3, which is a very weird move. Knight f4 and then knight g5. And I don't know, maybe it's still winning for white, but all this is just very, very hard to play. I don't think any human would find this, at least not with 6 seconds. So Vincent trades the knights. Magnus takes. We get king c7, and now we have king d3, king d7, and we get to move king e2. Now, the reason Magnus is winning here is that he has a protected passed pawn, but he can also start to play f3, try to open up the king side. Black has double pawns here. Black has no passed pawns either, so it's just simply lost. We get king c7, f3, king d7, and now Magnus takes on g4. We got takes, king d3, f5 played here, and now we get to move king d4. If black were to play king c7, just to illustrate the point, you go here, e4, attack the pawn, takes, king has to go away, you go over, you eat these pawns, and because you have the protected passed pawn here, if black ever tries to go forward and attack the base of the chain, you push the pawn through, you get a queen, and you win the game. And if black just stays, well, now you have 2 white peepos, and it's also a very simple win. So we get f5, king d4, king e6 here, and now Magnus plays c6. And at this point, Vincent resigns the game because after king d6, white pushes the p with c7, takes, king d7, king e5. White will win both of these pawns. You'll have 2 white peepos to march up the board, and you simply win. So Magnus gets a resounding victory in his first game of the Champions Chess Tour final with the white pieces. In the second game against Vincent, he would save a draw quite easily to win the first match by a score of 1.5 to half. So now we'll move on to the second match, where once again Magnus as a top-rated seed will start out the 2-game mini match with the white pieces against Jan Nepomniachtchi, the famous Russian grandmaster who contested 2 world championships against Magnus Carlsen and Ding Liren. He unfortunately would lose both of them, but he has played at the highest level. So a matchup of the old world championship between these 2 great players, and the game starts out with e4. Jan plays e5, Magnus goes knight f3, and we get knight f6. Now, it's very clear that for the last 4 years or thereabouts, Nepo has stuck to this opening, this Petrov's defense, ever since he played against Magnus in the World Championship. This has become his go-to opening. Now, he does play other openings, but this one is considered to be the most solid. Both Jan and Fabiano played it pretty successfully, I would say, against Magnus in the World Championship, and it's considered perhaps to be the best drawing weapon in the bag. So we get knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, and now we get knight takes e4, and here Magnus plays knight c3. We get takes. Important to note that here white usually takes with the d pawn because you want to open up the diagonals for the 2 b's. B takes is also playable with the idea of playing d4 and building a big white center, but theoretically it's considered to be simply less accurate. So we get takes. Bishop e7, Magnus goes bishop f4, and now we get the move knight d7, queen d2, castles, and now we get the move knight c5. Now, one of the arguments about taking with the pawn is not only do you have the open diagonal for this dark square b, but also you can try to use this open d file as well down the road. So black, for example, can't simply go c6 here trying to play d5, because if you get this is great, but if you go c6, you always potentially hang the pawn on d6. Now, I know in this specific position it's not working out, but just in general, there's always this half open file, so it's very hard to get the big black center with the connect 3 as well. So after knight c5, Magnus plays h4, with both sides having castled to opposite sides of the board. It's very thematic to start attacking. It's also worth pointing out another advantage, a third advantage of taking with this d pawn, is that if black tries to attack, because you have these 4 pawns around the king, it's actually very hard to attack the white king by pushing p on the queen side. So we get h4. Jan plays rook e8, Magnus goes bishop c4, we get bishop e6, takes, and now we have to move bishop e3. Game continues with c6 here. Nepo trying to build the connect 3 here in the center of the board. Now, of course, the bishop no longer is targeting the pawn on d6. So we get c4 here. Magnus trying to prevent d5 and create a permanent weakness on d6 here, and the game continues with bishop f8. Magnus plays h5, and now we get this interesting move a6 being played by Jan here. Now, the reason that I say this is an interesting move is that in this modern era, you'll probably have noticed that the computer programs like Lidla, AlphaZero, Stockfish, they all love pushing pawns on the edge of the board, and it's very unique, but there's so many situations where if you can get this position like in the game with this structure, even if there's no immediate threat towards this king, which is very safe currently, it's always considered to be better simply because you gain more space. So it's a little surprising to me that we didn't see h6 here. I suspect that Jan was afraid of g4 with the idea of g5, white just trying to attack. So you get a6, rook g1, for example. You'll notice that white is pushing p here. It's a very, very dangerous situation with the g file opening up here, and black can lose very quickly. That being said, after g4 queen f6, black would be okay here, so I just want to point that out. So we get a6, h6, g6. Now we get queen c3 here from Magnus, trying to spy this diagonal at the queen, maybe try to create a lolly checkmate on g7, but also now the rook pressures his pawn and queen on the d file. We get queen e7, rook he1, now we get f5, and here Magnus plays king b1. Now the big advantage Magnus has in this position is that in the long run there are these big weaknesses around the king, since you cannot fianchetto the bishop. If you get a position like this, for example, bishop h8 even, or bishop f6, black would potentially be doing very well in the long run with the bishop on this diagonal. So we get queen to f7. Now Magnus plays bishop c1, a nice move here. The rooks are on the open e and d files here. You have pressure on the diagonal. If you can set it up, you would love to create the classic double A battery with the bishop and the queen, and now this threat of queen h8 is simply deadly. If black blocks, you lose the b. If you move the queen, I check, and this is also a huge disaster where you're losing a ton of material and you'll lose the game as well. So we get f4 here, a nice logical move from Nepo. He closes down this diagonal and he wants to eat the juicer on h6. Here Magnus plays rook h1, and this is a move that frankly in a human game I completely understand. Computers actually say that after b4 white is much better here, and the reason is rather unusual, which is that after black takes here, because if black doesn't take, same issue with bishop b2, but after black takes, you play this move rook takes d6 here, and now in this position the main reason this is better for white is that this pawn covers the c5 square. This knight can never go to c5, and after bishop g7 and queen b3 with no knight c5 or knight d4 available here and the two rooks in the center of the board, computer gives white a big advantage. Now do I understand this? No, not at all. Do I think this would happen in a rapid or blitz game? No, definitely not, but it's worth pointing out how good the computers are in this modern world. So we get rook to h1 played by Magnus. Logical move, guard the pawn, try to create the double A battery. Here Jan plays bishop to e7, and this is a move that I really like because now black is basically getting the bishop on this long diagonal. You create the wooden shield here and it's looking quite decent. So Magnus goes back to e1. Now we get bishop to f8. And here we have the move g4 being played. Now this is an interesting spot here because of course for Magnus he must sense that he's a little bit better with his passed pawn here, the pressure in the center of the board, and he decides to go for the move g4. Now we get the move bishop takes h6, which is the best move here. It's a little bit unfortunate that bishop h6 is the best move because of course everyone is familiar with the classic glitch move in chess and peasant pawn takes pawn, but here this would be a big mistake because after takes the pawn is now permanently guarded by the bishop. There's also an open f file looming down the road here for the rook, and you still keep all the pressure in the middle of the board. So we get bishop takes pawn. Magnus takes on d6. We get bishop g7, and this is a mistake here. What Nepo should have played was knight to c5 here, trying to launch with the knight towards the center of the board to create all the forks in this position. Instead he goes bishop g7, and now we got to move queen a5. Now the big issue here is this knight on e6. It does not have oxygen. There are not many squares to go to. You would love to get this knight to c5 and e4. You would love to get it to d4, but with all these squares being covered by the white pieces here, you simply can't activate the knight, and that's why we get to move knight f8. Worth pointing out, let's just say black plays rook ac8. You can sack the rook with rook takes knight, and after takes knight g5, suddenly the queen and the rook are getting forked here. If you take the rook, I take the queen. Let's just say you move the rook back and we get this position. In this position I have a queen, a knight, and a bishop versus the two rooks. If you were to take the knight, you lose the rook in the game as well, so the material imbalance favors white. So we get knight to f8 here, trying to dodge any of the rook sacks, trying to avoid any forks, and now Magnus plays b3. Here we get rook takes rook, queen takes, and we get this move rook e8. Worth pointing out that b3 might look like a very scary move to play here because of this diagonal, but if black doesn't have an immediate way to line up a double A battery with, like, say queen f6, which hangs the queen, it's completely fine. Also b3 guards the pawn. Black is threatening to win this pawn on c4, so even if it looks scary, you guard the pawn on c4, and down the road you can play bishop b2, or even potentially create the lift for the king where it can run out as well, so that there are no ice skater checkmates. So we get rook takes rook. Magnus plays queen takes rook. We get rook e8, and now we have the move queen d2, targeting the pawn on f4. Nepo plays queen e7, and we get the move bishop b2, and here we have queen e2 on the board. Now after bishop b2, the computer actually thinks that black is doing quite well, but this is a situation where with the limited time, the moves for white here become much easier than for black. What do I mean by that? You have a weakness on f4. White looks to play on this open d file, and black has to deal with the threats of guarding the pawn, avoiding the infiltration on the open file, and also ideas like knight g5 even here potentially. So with all these threats in the air, it's on black to come up with a plan, and even though Nepo has a minute and a half more on the clock here, it's very difficult to play. And also, of course, we have the Magnus effect in the endgame where he is so dominant. So we get queen e2 here, and we have the move queen takes f4, and now we have queen f1 being played. Now the computers once again show how ridiculous they are, because after knight to e6 here, attacking the queen to e3, takes, and this move bishop h6, black is actually a little bit better here, primarily because white's extra pawn is a stacked pawn. This pawn is not going anywhere on the file, so you have the stacked pawn, but these pawns on e3 and g4 are very weak. If you go e4, for example, after knight c5, e5, rook to f8, now black is infiltrating on the f file. Your king on b1 is weak. Also, in the long run, just to set it up, say you get some position like this, just to illustrate the point, black even has h5 down the road to try and create this outside pass pawn and rush down the board. So in this position, we get queen f1 instead. Players low on time, logical move, and now we have queen c1. We get queen takes pawn, Magnus trades the bishops, and now he goes for queen f4. Now position here completely fine for Nepo, nothing to really freak out about, but the issue is that white's ideas with queen f6, knight g5, and all these ideas are very tough to deal with, and you also don't want to spend a lot of time, get too low on the clock, because then a blunder is almost certainly going to happen. So we get rook to e6, and this move is a blunder, after which black is in serious trouble here. Queen to e3 was the best move, and after check king g8 with the idea of queen to e7, black should be able to save the draw in this position. Instead, we get rook e6. Logical move, should be fine, right? Except it is not, and Magnus does not miss his opportunity. He plays the move rook d8. Now what I suspect Nepo thought was, well, just rook f6. I attack the queen and the knight. You move the queen, I win the knight, I win the game, and I win the match. But no, after rook to f6, there's the move queen to e5 here, pinning this rook on f6, and now after you take the knight, there's g5, winning the rook on f6 due to the pin, and black is going to sack the rook and lose the game in the process. So I think what happened is Nepo just assumed he had rook f6 and he was completely fine, but after this move, the best move according to the computer is g5 here, which frankly is an insane move to play. You could try h6, but to illustrate why this is so lost, now white will sack the rook, rook takes knight. If you take, you lose the rook in the game, and after queen takes f3 is played here, now white can simply move the rook back to d8, the queen b8, queen c7, rook d7. So many ideas against this weak black king, and white's king here is chilling on b1. It's just going to go to b2. It's guarded by all these pawns, and this is just GG, why not? So here Nepo plays queen c5, the best move, and now we get to move rook to b8, a nice move to move the rook away from the d file. Now queen e7 doesn't attack it, but it also hits the pawn and spies the knight at the same time. Nepo plays queen e7, and now Magnus plays g5, and this is just a great positional move because it stops all the ideas of rook f6. You can't push the pawns on the king side, and now there are all kinds of threats. This move is just a genius move, and now it's almost impossible to defend. So we got c5, trying to stop white from playing knight to d4 here. Now we get a4, and Nepo plays move a5. Magnus goes queen d2, and here we get the move b6, and we get queen c3 check on the board. Now we get king to g8, and here Magnus plays queen d2, and we get this move queen c7. Now you will have noticed Magnus has not been super precise, but at this point in the game with such limited time, you try to go for simple thematic plans. So we get queen c7, rook d8 is played, now we get queen to f7, and Magnus goes queen d5. Here we get this move king g7, and this move is a blunder which loses immediately. The best move to play was rook to e3, attacking the horse on f3, but much more importantly, offering the trade of the queens. Now, do I think that Nepo would have drawn if he'd played this? Probably not, because this position still looks incredibly scary here. White's pushing p up the board. There's knight c4 to hit the pawn on b6, but the computer says after rook e5, d6, king f7, knight c4, and rook to e8, great move by the way, forcing a trade of the rooks, black should save the game. Now, would you find this with 40 seconds on the clock? Very, very unlikely, but it is a cool variation nonetheless. So here we get king g7, and now we have the move knight. We have the move rook to b8 being played. Knight e5 also is good, by the way, but rook b8 is also incredibly strong here because the idea is to pressure the pawn, pressure the knight, and you have rook b7 to create the kebab and the pin on the 7th ring. Now we get knight to d7 being played. This move does lose immediately, but already here, frankly, playing queen f5 is very, very tough. I'm not even sure that that, you know, that this would last. The computer wants king b2 here, and white's better. Even a move like rook b7, king g8, and then something like king b2 again should be good. That being said, it would have forced Magnus to play one more good move. Instead, we got to move knight to d7. Now we have rook b7, pinning the knight, rook e7, and now we get the huge move queen d6, and black is tied up in knots here. You can't ever move the knight without losing the rook, which means the knight is pinned. You can't really move the queen. You go here, takes, you lose the knight, you lose the game. What else can you do? You can still go queen e8, and then there's knight e5, which is winning here. At any rate, all of this is collapsing. Black's king, his knight, his rook, everything is too loose here. We do get the blunder here with king f8 played by Nepo, and after rook takes d7, he resigns the game. But just to go back one more time here, probably queen e8 is the move that I would play in a game, but after knight to e5, you take the knight. After takes, you lose the queen, and after rook takes king g8, there's simply rook to d8, winning the queen on e8. So we end up getting king f8, rook takes d7, and here Jan Nepomniachtchi resigns the game against Magnus Carlsen, because if you take the knight, it's simply checkmate in 2, and if you don't, you play king e8, there's rook d8 mate. But even something like this is also more than enough with an extra horse on the board. So all the variations are hopeless, and for that reason the game ends right here. So Magnus wins this game to take a 1-0 lead in the match. He would draw very comfortably in the second game to clinch a victory in the first 2 matches. So Magnus is off to a very, very fast start in the Champions Chess Tour. He's showing once again why he is the best player in the world, and I'm really looking forward to doing recaps as the matches continue, especially when they get into the knockout stage. It's looking like players like Ali Reza are off to a good start as well, so it should be really exciting to cover. But on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the first day of the Champions Chess Tour final in 2024 being held in Oslo, Norway. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more recaps as Magnus continues his dominance in this event. See you guys soon. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.